Welcome everybody who's joining us. As you're entering the room, please take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're coming from, what your line of work is. And as we, during the conversation, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A, not the chat, because I'm not able to keep track of the chat. And then we'll, if there's time at the end, I'll include those. And also when you introduce yourself, please make sure to say to everyone, not just to panelists. So those of you who have introduced yourself so far, you've just introduced yourself to us. So if you can go back and put to everyone, that would be great. So again, welcome everyone who's joining us for the American Botanical Council and Sustainable Herbs Program Ethnobotany webinar series. Wanted to say a few words to begin. Is that working? Yeah. Today's webinar is Rapid Change in Himalayan Ethnobotany, and I'll introduce the speakers in a moment. And the next in the Ethnobotany webinar series will be on April 8th, and that's Ethics in Indigenous Practices. And I'll be speaking with Kelly Bannister, who has really led the way in rethinking the ethical implications of working on ethnobotany and in Indigenous communities around the world. And she'll be joined by another speaker that is still to be confirmed. And then we're also the separate webinar series is the Sustainable Herbs Program Sustainability and Regenerative Practices Toolkit series. And I'm really excited about the next two in this series, which are going to be looking at really how to create healthy soils and healthy communities while growing botanicals for the botanical industry. The first one will be with corporate-owned farms, and that's on March 18th. And then the second one will be with smaller family-owned farms, and that's on April 1st. And all of that information and additional information on the topics and the speakers is on the Sustainable Herbs Program and the American Botanical Council websites, and you can register for those now. And so these webinars are made available for free through the generous support of the Sustainable Herbs Program underwriters. And you can see this is a range of really high quality botanical companies. You can find out more information on our website and links to their websites. And the webinars are also made free through the generous memberships of the American Botanical Council. And you can find out more information about becoming a member on the American Botanical Council website. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and introduce the speakers for today. As I said, we're looking at rapid change in the Himalayas, which is an area near and dear to my heart. And so I'm especially looking forward to this conversation. And I'm joined by Jan Salick and Robbie Hart. And Jan Salick is an ethnobotanist and senior curator at the Missouri Botanical Garden, where she's worked in various capacities since 2000. She's taught botany, ethnobotany, ecology, and evolution. And her research has taken her all over the world, and that's included 15 years in the Himalayas, in Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal, studying the effects of climate change on plants and peoples. In 2019, she was awarded the David Fairchild Medal for Plant Exploration in recognition of a lifetime of service. So welcome, Jan. It's great to have you. We're also joined by Robbie Hart, and Robbie Hart got his doctorate in biology, and so he approaches ethnobotany from a natural sciences perspective, with particular interest in using quantitative methods from ecology for ethnobotanical questions. For the past 12 years, he spent working in the Himalayas, looking also at how climate change affects when plants bloom, where they grow, and how they are used by people. Robbie is also the William L. Brown Curator of Economic Botany at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and he's the director of the William Brown Center. and he'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But anyway, welcome both of you. I'm so glad to have you here and to have a chance to dive in a little bit to your work. Jan, I wondered if you could start and just tell us a bit about how you came into ethnobotany and really this focus on climate change.
Well, I joined the ranks of ethnobotanists fairly late because there was no sort of major in that when I came through. So I majored in ecology and systematics, but I got a postdoc with Ian Prance at the New York Botanical Garden, and then later a assistant scientist position there as an ethnobotanist. And at that time, I wasn't even sure what that was. You know, I had collected a lot of indigenous crops and wild crop relatives and so on. So I'd sort of worked around the edges of ethnobotany, but it wasn't until, and at that time, then I went to Peru and worked with indigenous tribes in the Peruvian Amazon, Upper Amazon. So that was really the beginning. But when I came to the Missouri Botanical Garden, then they were doing the flora of China, and they said, "Would you be interested in working in China?" And I said, "Sure, absolutely." So the day after I joined, they shipped me off to China and traveled all over, you know, looking for possible projects and everything, and flying all over. I ended up flying up into the Himalayas, and I thought, no, I have no real qualifications in the Himalayas. I can't work here. But once you see them, you just sort of fall in love immediately. So it was like, oh, okay, twist my arm, I'll work in the Himalayas. Yeah. So yeah, that's since 2000. So it's now 20 years. But it's been, you know, in retrospect, you think you've been meant for this your whole life. But my mother worked with indigenous American Indians and various peoples, and my father was a naturalist. So together they made me.
That's great. I wanted to ask you a little bit more. And what were the questions that really drew you, that you found most compelling? I mean, the Himalayas are beautiful and spectacular, but.
Right. Well, as far as, I mean, I'd been aware of questions in climate change since I was a graduate student in the 70s and 80s. So, you know, the scientific interest in climate change had started then, and I'd been teaching about climate change, and so I, you know, was well aware of it, but nowhere was it quite as obvious as it was in the Himalayas, and not only obvious to me, but to the Tibetans themselves. And when we would discuss problems that they had and things that they were facing, many aspects of climate change would come up. The locals' vision, awareness of climate change was very keen and very specific. So we did quite a bit of research on that too. So that's where the climate change came in.
Great, and we'll dive into this a little more. Robbie, I'd love to hear a bit about the key questions you're really drawn to in ethnobotany and how you came to the work that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I actually started out as a linguist. My undergraduate training is in linguistics, and I was born in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and I first went to the Himalayas as part of study abroad in this undergraduate linguistics career, and really fell in love with it. And also first there started to see this interaction between people who know deeply about local flora, local plants, and who also retain an indigenous language. So to see this connection between cultural diversity, and particularly linguistic diversity, and also botanical diversity that I think a lot of us have seen is so dramatic across the world, and particularly in the Himalayas. So I knew then I wanted to follow that up. I didn't know exactly how, but several years I was able to start addressing these questions with Jan as my graduate mentor, looking at this from the perspective of biology. So looking at how, as you said in your introduction, how climate change affects both alpine plants, but also the people that use them and the ways in which they're able to use them. So continuing with that research, I'm very interested in high mountain plants and in mountain and high elevation communities around the world. And I'm also have a continuing interest in language and in traditional ecological knowledge as it's packaged in language and in other ways. And in looking in quantitative ways as well as qualitative ways at how that's communicated, how it's transmitted, and how we can, try to assist with the continuance of both plant species and traditional knowledge.
I love the link between the linguistic diversity and the botanical diversity, because it's more specific than just cultural diversity and then the loss of that. But before getting into that also, so I'd love to hear each of you talk about, so why mountains? What is it unique about mountains and alpine plants?
Well, it was, with climate change, there are two areas that are most rapidly affected by climate change. One is the Arctic, but there aren't that many plants in the Arctic. There are, obviously there are some, but the second one is mountains, and particularly the Himalayas. And there's we joined a whole group of mountain botanists around the world studying the effects of climate change on mountain flora, so that we could take advantage of, we were really on the forefront in gaining scientific data on the effects of climate change, how climate change affected plants as well as people. And so we were looking for an area where we were hoping we could see those changes over a time period somewhat less than our lifetime. It got pretty close with me, but so that was the reason for that.
And mountains are great because they they contain populations of plants that are under this very intense climatic regimen, right? That at least ecologists tend to think that what you see here is communities of plants that are really strongly affected by temperature, because they're subject to these extreme temperatures, these short growing seasons. And as you can see on lots of mountains around the world, this elevational gradation of vegetation, where which plant species are there, changes across elevation. So it offers a really nice ecological tool or study system to look at changes, even though they might be subtle changes. And as Jan says, also the mountains around the world, actually there's been evidence that mountains are actually experiencing more warming than other places around the world. But the Himalayas in particular are experiencing even more rapid warming. And I was really happy to see that Rick Silber's here in the audience, because there's a piece he co-authored in New York Times recently that really sets that out, the rapid effects of climate change in the Himalaya, and also just the rapid climate change as well as its rapid effects.
Well, and I'm also really glad to see Gabriel Campbell is here. And I worked with Gabriel Campbell years ago with the Makalu Conservation Project, and he spent years in Nepal with Isimode and the Mountain Institute on conservation. So to think more, so Jan, can you talk, so this methodology, as I understand it, is that the Gloria methodology? Can you talk a little bit about that, and for a layperson like me who is not?
So just starting out looking at climate change, we said, okay, well, what kind of basic research should we do? And we did a lot of various kinds of ethnobotanical research, but we thought, well, we should also be looking at how the plants are changing. But we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So there was this Gloria methodology, and it's sort of crazy. It's real Germanic, very thorough methodology and very standardized. And basically what you do is you look at the vegetation between tree line and, the highest realms of plant life in the mountains. And where that is in different continents is different. So the Europeans are working between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, which is quite civilized. They drive up to their sites in cars and they, unload their equipment. Well, for us, it's between 4,000 and 5,000 meters, and there's no roads, so we're hiking in for weeks sometimes to get to some of our sites, and working at extremely high elevations and camping out and so on. So it got to be a bit rugged, but it was spectacular. And I said, there's sort of 95% of the time you are miserable, but that 5% of the other 5%, you're just in heaven. So, you persevere with the methodology. But anyway, so there's a whole bunch of different methods, but you pick summits at these different elevations, 4 summits at different elevations at each site. And then there's a Blanc a kind of a general survey of species and how common they are. And then there are these incredibly exacting, meter square plots, 32 meter square plots on each mountaintop, that you are down there on your stomach, hands and knees, and counting every individual plant in centimeter square, subdivisions of each of those. And you mark those all out. And so then you go back in a 7-year period, 7 years later, and you recensus everything. So extremely exacting. But as I said, it's a technique that's being used around the world, and so we can make comparisons with other mountains everywhere, and that's very useful.
And it takes a long time to start to get, I'm sorry, Anne.
No, go ahead.
It takes a long time to start to get the results beyond the baseline results. Of course, the minimum is 7 years, but then it just picks up momentum as you go. So we were really excited to in 2019, be able to go and do our first site, do the 3rd survey at them. So to be able to have this project that Jan and her collaborators started 15 years ago, that we can then see along multiple time points how the temperatures have changed exactly, how the plant compositions have changed, and really get this rigorous species-specific, location-specific window into how climate change is affecting these plants.
And so the first, when you went back for the first 7 years, what did you find? And was it what you expected, or were you surprised? Or what was surprising and what wasn't?
Yeah, no, I think there were some unexpected. There were some things that because we had seen what was happening in Europe, we were expecting, something similar, and some of it was similar, but some of it was dissimilar. So in general, the species diversity and frequency of plants in the alpine is increasing tremendously because of the warmer temperatures and less snowfall and so on. And we found plants moving up the mountain from plants that need warmth, moving up the mountain into the alpine that hadn't been there previously at lower elevations. But the surprising thing was what we found at higher elevations, 5,000 meters. What we found is that we got more endemic species than we had previously. And all the other mountains around the world are getting many fewer, that endemics are disappearing elsewhere. And we don't really know the cause of it, but it looks as though there are so many endemic species in the Himalayas. The Himalayas are famous for or endemics. You know, there are just so many unique species in the Himalayas, and that they're distributing themselves from mountaintop to mountaintop. You know, when you specialize on mountaintops, you have to find ways to get from one mountaintop to another. You know, you have to be dispersed. You don't go down the mountain and then up the next mountain, because they just don't grow at lower elevations. So here we were finding more endemic species, and that difference really says something about the Himalayas and how diverse the plant life is in the Himalayas.
Robbie, do you want to elaborate more on what
Sure.
plants
So
are changing, and then the phenology, you know, weaving in the additional, and as you answered, someone as Gabriel Campbell has asked the location of the field sites, if you could weave that in.
sure. So we have, in terms of our Gloria, what the Gloria program calls target regions, we have 9 of them that we coordinate in collaboration with local teams in each country. And so those are spread across southwest China. So the far sort of eastern extent of the greater Himalayan region was where Jan and her colleagues first set up the first sites. And now they've extended through sites in central and western Bhutan, and sites in central and eastern Nepal. So it's a 1,500 or 2,000 kilometer transect across the Himalaya that we're able to get a look at. And so then you asked about a couple of things, phenology, as well as sort of more elaboration on the changes in the plants themselves. So I just want to be clear about what Jan said, that, you know, the basic idea that we're seeing more green there, so more plant richness, but also more plant cover, is something that we had expected to see, or at least hypothesized might be the case. As things get warmer, you do see more plants. And what they saw in Europe was that most of these plants, or more and more of these plants, tended to be those associated with lower elevation. So they were getting a signal of plants all moving upwards. And Jan mentioned that, you know, interestingly, we're only seeing that at our lowest sites. We're not seeing it at the highest elevation sites yet. But of course, even though the plants are increasing, we have more richness and more cover, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're functioning in the same way, especially in their relationships with other plants, with other animals, or other organisms like animals, such as pollinators, or with other organisms like people who rely on these plants as medicinal plants and as pasture for yaks and cows. So one of the ways that they can, you know, first of all, they can just not be in the same places. So there's more of this plant, but it's not where people are coming to look for it, or where a pollinator is coming to look for it. Secondly, they can be coming at different times. So in my dissertation work, which was my first field work in the Himalaya as a biologist, I was looking at how climate change can affect the flowering times of plants. So as you might expect, often in a warmer year, plants are flowering earlier, but that can change, and different species have different limitations on exactly how much they can react to climate in that way. And that means that just as plants might not be growing where they usually grow, they might not be growing when they usually grow. So a pollinator or a medicinal plant collector or a yak might not be encountering the same species when it happens to be in the field on the mountain.
And so can you say, so, and what difference does that make? Why does that matter?
Well, there can be, you know, lots of impacts from this. So, you know, what's common across a lot of studies of climate change around the world that involve the perceptions of local and indigenous people is a sense of everything's different now. I'm stealing a title from Nancy Turner there, but that everything's messed up, that what we're seeing is climate weirding. And so when there are these calendars of overlapping seasonal events in the natural world, ecological calendars, that people in many cases have relied on to make decisions like when to plant a certain crop, those are disrupted. Indicators like a certain plant species. In my early research, I was looking at rhododendrons. So certain rhododendron species that have been traditionally known to flower at the right time to plant buckwheat, I was told are now flowering at the right time to plant potatoes, which requires some sort of dynamism and attention on the part of this traditional reckoning system to be able to adapt to the climate-driven change. In the case of some plants that rely on pollinators to maintain their populations, if the plants and the pollinators aren't coming at the same time, that can mean detrimental effects to the populations or local extinction. And in the other case I mentioned, for instance, with yaks or other grazers, yaks and cattle, we've been told by herders that some pretty subtle changes in the flora of the fodder species. These are grasses, but also sedges as well. Those can have trickle-down effects in the quality of the butter and the quality of the cheese that are important protein sources and important cultural items throughout the Himalayas, I think it's fair to say.
Just the layers of Joseph Brinkman has talked about this in wild harvesting, communities where they have their economic structures around harvesting plants at certain times. Once that's changed, the whole economic livelihood gets disrupted. Jan, I wondered if you wanted to add to what you found.
Yeah, I did want to add in here a little bit, because we did a lot of, and you people are interested in medicinals, so we did a lot of research on Tibetan medicine and what's happening with medicinal plants. Traditionally, Tibetan doctors go up into the mountains for a month of the year in the summertime to collect medicinal plants. A lot of their medicines come from high alpine areas. So our research, our botanical research on the alpine then feeds into the ethnobotany about how Tibetans are, how climate change is affecting Tibetans. And it's in many more ways than just medicinals, but I'll mention those first and then move on to the other factors. But so almost all the doctors that we interviewed and worked with noticed climate change. They may not call it climate change. A lot of our work, the Chinese government wasn't advertising climate change, so people were noticing changes but didn't have a name for it but when we went out and interviewed, we found that almost everybody recognized the fact that there was less snow, that the temperatures were warmer, that there were more avalanches, that there were any number of the glaciers were receding and rain was coming at a different time and changing. So they saw these changes. And the Tibetan doctors were really worried that the medicines that they depend on might be affected. And you disappeared. Oh, there you are. But they have two real worries, and probably the most immediate worry that they have is overharvesting, because the Chinese government decided that Tibet is one of the most economically impoverished parts of China, if you recognize them as that. And so they decide, well, we'll sell medicinal plants, and that will, bring in money to Tibet. Unfortunately, I won't go into all the details, but anyway, that when you open up a market like that on a large scale, they would come in with trucks and just tell people, and they do it species by species, collect all, the snow lotus you can find. So the village would, go out and cut down every snow lotus they could find, and then bring it back, and they would sell it for little of nothing to the buyers that would then haul them off to the cities. And that these are all alpine plants are slow growing, and they're snow lotus in particular blooms once in its life. It'll grow for 10 or 20 years and finally bloom. And then just before it's going to set seed, along come these harvesters and lop off the top of the plant. And so it never reproduces. So the over harvesting is probably a much greater immediate impact than climate change is. But nonetheless, climate change is, as we have been noticing, is affecting medicinal plants. But climate change is also affecting Tibetans in many, many other ways that they are more aware of. The crops that they're growing, they tend to be growing more warm-loving crops, which in turn puts them into the market, because then if you're not just growing these, a little bit of barley and buckwheat and that sort of thing, then all of a sudden you've got fruits and vegetables and you sell to the market. And once you enter the market economy, then your whole, livelihood strategies change tremendously. So we really found that throughout Nepal and Bhutan, these high elevation communities were really what we called a tipping point in climate change, because they were changing so dramatically from one kind of traditional farming to another sort of livelihood completely.
There's so many things there. One I wanted to draw out and make sure was clear. So there are kind of two separate supply chains for the botanical, right? There's the Tibetan doctors who would be going up to gather, and then there are those who are trucked in, and that those are going as a more commodity.
Yes, it turns into a total commodity. And we did some very detailed population studies and found out that the small amounts that local doctors are harvesting for treating their local patients, the populations can sustain that kind of a harvest. But once they come into these mass harvesting, there's just no way that those populations maintain themselves.
And this is something that doesn't always make its way into the Gloria field work we do, but especially with our sites in Nepal, I want to recommend the work that our major collaborator there, Dr. Suresh Kamire, is doing, led by a series of graduate students, where he's been looking at these plants that we encounter in the Gloria plots and that we know to be affected by climate change, but which are also under this intense harvest pressure, and trying to actually do the work and the quantification to say, for this particular species and its species biology, how much harvest is acceptable? Are there levels of harvest that might actually increase its yield? And what are the levels of harvest that are inevitably going to drive it towards local extirpation?
And another aspect that we studied that we found was very interesting is how Tibetan cosmology was changing with climate change. You don't think about, so many things change. I mean, their traditional clothing changes because they, used to wear these heavy yak robes and so on, and they can't. It's hot now. They can't wear those anymore. And they used to eat very fatty meats and high, and everybody's having heart problems now because they don't, they're not burning it off in the cold the way they used to. And so many things change, but also their religion is changing, and they're frantically trying to deal with these aspects of climate change, and they don't know, and it often, they don't. It breaks your heart because they're blaming themselves, for climate change, and it's like, no, it's not your fault. But they they look at it in terms of Buddhism, they look at it in terms of kind of shamanism, and then, you know, the little bit of science that they know, they're also, and they try to weave all these ideas together. But it's really, and they're praying to almost any, you know, God that they can think of. And you just see these ceremonies going on where these farmers are just praying for rain or praying for less rain, or, you know, being there at the avalanches that are falling, and the mountains themselves are sacred. And so they see the glaciers and the snow melting off the mountains, and they think their gods are disappearing, that they're, you know, leaving Earth. And so it's the effects of climate change are so drastic, you know, from the individual plant level, you know, to, you know, people's whole view of the universe.
I wonder how is that to do research, which can be on one level, you know, you're doing plant species meter, you know, counting plants, and it's around such huge, you know, ethical issues.
That's why we do the ethnobotany. So we don't only do the plant, you know, the minute plant research, but we're also doing, you know, we're interviewing people, you know, we do all these different kinds of mapping exercises, and we study people's farming. And so we, you know, it's just not one aspect that we look at, but we try to look at it, and we study their religion, you know, so we're looking at as many things as we can.
And I will say, I mean, I think that one of the ways that we can powerfully have an effect on this beyond just being scientists is by affecting policy. And you know, Jan has worked for years and years to try to get these sorts of understandings, and the colleagues we work with and some of the local people we work with into international policy documents, into international policy meetings, so that they can have a voice at the table, and that these big frameworks that affect how we look at climate change can actually, you know, be informed by some of this work.
And I also wondered, then maybe now is a time when you could talk some about the other, so when you're, as a scientist working in communities where their lives are being changed so much, what else can, I mean, I always feel this urgency of like, I need to do something to help. And I wondered how you.
Well, we have had sort of you know, small scale development project kind of things where, you know, one community we built a school, and one community we built a health center, and, you know, we have all these different local activist projects that we do, but we are, you know, we are academics, so we're kind of publisher parish types, but and development is not our major role, but we certainly, you know, you can't help but do that along the way, because you're living with these people, and you know how they're being affected. So, you know, we bought a water pump for, you know, one village. And so different, depending on what their needs were. Agroforestry projects, they wanted to introduce, you know, fruit trees all of a sudden can grow in Nepal at a much higher elevation than they ever grew before, and so they wanted fruit trees and so on. So, you know, we try to do something to share, you know, so we're not there just taking out information, but also sharing things.
And I think that sort of kind of communication about the goals has also been really important to us, and it's been important to build over time. You know, I had the wonderful advantage of stepping into field sites that Jan and her national level local colleagues had already established and had been to for years, and had some sort of sense with the local people that they would continue to keep working there. And I think then one can build a sort of communication and recognize that not all of your goals are always going to be shared. You know, we do care about collecting these sort of minute level, fine, sometimes esoteric from certain contexts, details about plant life. But sometimes we can find shared goals. You know, one thing I found when I was working on rhododendron was when I asked people about rhododendron uses, the first thing everyone would say to me is, that's a useless plant. You know, it's not an important medicinal species. It's not an important crop species. It's just a pretty flower. But then in the conversation, they'd go on to talk for an hour about all the ways rhododendron in fact is used. So it was something that was, you know, something that was more relevant to me as a visiting botanist than to the local people, in fact. But it was something where hopefully, you know, we can use it to tell a climate change story and have an impact, you know, at some level, at least communication level, on climate change policy again, which I think is the most important way that we can all actually affect the underlying problem here.
I know following that, there's a lot of good questions that I want to turn to in a second, but I'm curious how this work has changed each of you, sort of, and it could be, that can be answered any way, but has it, I mean, yeah, you can answer it however you want.
Oh, this is, I can't even begin to say how many, and it's not only the work itself, but the students I've been working with. Every student brings their own strengths and into these projects and their own ideas. And so one of my students was desperately interested in sacred sites, and so we ended up publishing 4 papers on sacred sites and biodiversity and so on. And never in my life have I ever, you know, done any research like that. But and just the profound ways that the Tibetans will think about the surrounding world, and the world, and how world and religion and everything are just part and parcel of the same thing. And you can feel how deep these people relate to different topics, and it's fascinating, and how clever they are. You know, they're just unbelievably clever. We'd get into trouble on one thing or another, and we'd come up with an answer, or, you know, we'd have to push through in unbelievable conditions, and push through we did, you know. So yeah, the people taught me a tremendous amount.
I think by nature, I'm someone who sometimes will be nervous to ask for help. I want to try to, you know, push something as far as I can myself before I go bothering someone with a request for help. And international field work in any context sure teaches one how wrong that attitude is very quickly. The extent to which we rely on these strong collaborations with local scientists in each of these countries, the extent to which we rely on their students and the local people around these field sites is just really obvious. So every year and every time we go out in the field or have to ask them a question over email or over the phone when it's possible, that becomes more and more clear to me.
Great, thank you. There are a lot of questions about the harvesting of traditional herbs, and so I wanted to have time for that. There's questions around who owns the land where the herbs are being harvested, and then kind of connected, and that probably is different for the Tibetan doctors as well as in the Chinese. But has there been resistance to the increased commercial collection and sale of traditional herbs?
In China, which includes Tibet, technically. No one owns land. The government owns the land. So, but nonetheless, there are, villages lay claim to certain lands, and some very famous research, I think, by Yi on how people are killed when they step over the line and harvest from someone else's village, and since these products are worth so much money, that it gets to be a major, harvest of matsutake mushrooms puts all the kids through school, that it supports a village. They don't have a lot of cash economy, but matsutake mushrooms really make it a cash economy for otherwise these kids couldn't go to school. So it can be extremely important and can be deadly. But land tenure is weird, in China. Was there more to that question? Or
the matsutake mushroom, is that I'm not familiar with that. Is that separate then from cordyceps?
Yes, matsutake makes more money than cordyceps. Cordyceps makes money as well as cordyceps is the everybody's been hearing about that, but matsutake is amazing. Particularly, they harvest it during the day, and then they take the mushrooms and they individually wrap them in rhododendron leaves, and they take them down to the road heads, and at night these 4x4 Jeeps will come careening across these roads that are just hair-raising, in the daytime, and here they are traveling at night, and they stop at one roadhead after another road, and they buy matsutake mushrooms from everybody. And by the morning, they're back in the closest airport, and those mushrooms fly off to Japan, and they're on the market by that's next within 24 hours. They're on the fresh market in Japan for hundreds of times what the purchase price in the villages, but it's extremely important for the villagers, and it just happens at one time of year, and the whole village goes out, and that's what they do, is they harvest matsutake mushrooms. They're fantastic mushrooms. They taste delicious. They're really, in this country, are mushrooms that we think are great here are considered trash mushrooms in China. They're just so they have a much bigger appreciation of mushrooms than we do, as do the Japanese. Why they sell so many.
And so we've mentioned two sort of fungal related species, matsutake mushrooms and cordyceps or ophiocordyceps. And those are really very important cash crops, cordyceps across the entire Himalaya and the permafrost area. There are also, of course, plant species that are important cash crops. Nardisacus jatamansi is one in Nepal that's quite valuable. But yeah, and I think in general, what Jen was saying for China goes for our other sites to some extent as well, is that what we often see is that most of the areas we work in the high mountains are subject to some sort of broader national control, be it a national park or a national conservation area or a protected area, no matter what it's exactly called. But almost all of them have a strong de facto sense of ownership by the local communities, the local villages, I guess, in most cases.
In fact, my dissertation research was looking at the traditional systems of common property resource management in Eastern Nepal. I wanted to follow up. So another part of that question was whether there's been any movement around overharvesting, around Tibetan organization, or are the Chinese doing anything? But I wanted to add into the Jatamansi. A few weeks ago, as one of these webinars, we spoke with someone from Ansab who was talking about the efforts to get Fair Wild certified Jatamansi coming from Nepal. And that project's just in the early stages. But I wondered if you know of other, what Tibetan communities are doing, or any awareness around addressing that overharvesting.
I don't know that the Chinese government has owned up to the problems with overharvesting. We published one paper that showed that over 100 years, snow lotus have shrunk in size by almost a half because they get more money for larger snow lotus. So it's got, not only is the plant disappearing, but the morphology of the plant is changing so drastically. And we tried to get it on the endangered species list in China and never could. But I may be out of date. I haven't worked in China for the last 5 years. So, but I mean, I keep hearing about, the same thing going on in Mongolia and so on, that they're just harvesting like crazy. So I don't think that's become an issue that I've heard of.
And I guess these are globally important resources, and they are important around the world, and they have been important in market economies from the Himalayas for a long time too. I'm not an economist, but from everything I've seen, it's really hard to overstate the importance of the Chinese market as driving these big swings in cost and these big swings in demand and extraction. That a lot of the, it may be different in some species versus others, but in almost every species I read about, most of the demand is coming from mainland China.
Yeah, we could continue talking about that for a while. I wanted to, there's a slightly different tack of a question by Fabian Schultz, which gets to the work that the Brown Center, I think, is doing, but he or she, sorry, writes, I'm interested in whether you transfer results of your published studies back to the local communities. If so, how do you transfer results back? What are the most effective methods? Or just how you work with the local, either the village or the national government communities, to the exchange of knowledge.
Yeah, different projects we've done differently. We have personally gone back because just writing it up doesn't really work very well, but we've gone back to the communities and talked about it. We have community meetings and we discuss what we found, and I always like it when I get feedback from them. Are we interpreting this right? What do you think about this? And so on, because they'll have much better insights often than I do, because they're living there. But yeah, we try to, we've done posters and things like that, but I'm never terribly convinced by that sort of thing. And elsewhere in the world, I've done a lot. I've tried a lot of different ways, but since we're working so closely with the local people, I think just talking to them really helps as much as anything. But we do have students, particularly in Nepal. Well, China too. We had lots of students, and so that's great feedback. That give them an opportunity for education and for entering into the research, and then when they go back, then they have a lot more impact than we ever could.
Yeah, and I think one of the answers that we often see in projects like this is sort of locally facing publications, kind of image forward books that can be distributed locally. And we have done that in some cases, again, for some other projects. But Jan's right that it really depends on the target communities. Some places that we work in, in Yunnan, a lot of our target audience has cell phones and constant web access and can really benefit, like something like one pilot project we did with doing a small talking dictionary of ethnobotanically important plants, where people could see this plant species and hear the name spoken by a native speaker, when that specialized terminology or indeed the language itself might be something they don't have a lot of access to. So that was something where people had that technological capacity already, but they didn't necessarily have the cultural access. And we could do something that was relevant in that way. So I think, but of course that would be, totally inappropriate in a different community. We have also had issues where local communities ask actually for previous generations of scholarship to be repatriated, and that can be as simple as sending them PDFs, which they're locked out of because the academic system is really geared towards big Western institutions that have library subscriptions that they can pay for. Or in some cases, it can be translating and putting into print form, previous generations of scholarship. And it's always also great, and one benefit of this, it's not only ethically important and it not only shows reciprocity, but it also elicits meta commentary, right? That Jan's done a lot of work with old pictures that were sort of taken of a local place and then taken out of their context and put in archives and books in the West. And to talk to someone in the village now about what this picture of their village shows in terms of the change over the last 100 years can be really powerful. Or to, as my undergrad advisor, David Harrison, does, to videotape someone talking about the use of a certain plant in their native language, and then show them the video and elicit this meta commentary of, what are their thoughts about this? What might they want to correct, or what add to it or change about it? It just adds to the amount of data and understanding that then we have.
Yeah, that research with the old photographs was it was such a riot to do, because we would just get crowds of old people coming around. These pictures are from 100 years ago, and they could recognize, oh, look at this, and look at how different this is and everything. And they would just get groups and groups of people, and we just, we couldn't write fast enough. We would get so much information on change, which is what we were interested in. And it was great. And the other thing that we did was hand out cameras, little pocket cameras and things, and let people, okay, you show me what you think is, what changes are important. And again, just absolutely wonderful photographs of that people. And then you bring these photographs back to them, and they are just so pleased. They are just so happy to have. We got this one photograph of this man. I don't know how close he was to this bear. It was just like, it looked like it was wrapped around the camera. He's got, these are little pocket cameras, so it's not like you have a telephoto lens on it, So, and he was a hero in the village for having come up with this photo. But anyway, yeah, when you interact very closely with the villagers and so on, it's just, or even if they just draw maps, they pour themselves into it. Got great photographs of these people all bending over the local snooker table, drawing these maps and everything. And it's just, they're really super into it. They just really concentrate hard. So any interaction that you've got with people. And then of course, if you build them a school, they'll do anything for you, because their kids get to go to school.
Well, it's one advantage, long-term projects like the Gloria project, where you come back again and again to monitor a long-term change, are not always super amenable to grant deadlines, but they are really amenable to building up a long-term relationship with a community and bringing back information and demonstrating that you have an investment in that community.
Yeah, thank you. We're coming to the end of the hour, but there's one question. I mean, there's a lot of questions that are good questions here that we don't have time to answer, but there's one that kind of flows from what you've both been talking about. So I want to include it if we can have 1 or 2 more minutes. This is, what is your opinion about the loss of indigenous knowledge about materia medica in the Himalayas within the last century? Is handing down medicinal knowledge still strong in the communities, or are the youth aiming for a more modern Western way of life?
Um,
Yeah.
well, I can answer that in so many ways. Everybody's interested in a Western medicine. When one of the things that you do is you ask, well, what would you like me to do? And, you have to be careful. I went to the Amazon and they wanted me to teach them how to grow apples. And I said, oh, sorry, that's not going to happen. But the Tibetan doctors wanted me to get a Western doctor to come up and teach them Western medicine because they are interested in integrating. They don't believe in one system and one system only, sort of. But I didn't have that opportunity. But on the other hand, they're very interested in continuing the Tibetans are just desperate for cultural continuity. So they're very interested in keeping their traditional medicine going. And what's so important there, which is not immediately obvious, is that there's so many different kinds of Tibetan medicine. On the one extreme, there's the stuff that's sold in markets that I was telling you about that they're harvesting so much of. And that's a whole different medical tradition than is taught in the medical schools in Lhasa. But what's taught in the medical schools in Lhasa is a completely different tradition, again, from what is in every village. So there's local Tibetan medicine that is just worlds apart from what the Chinese government recognizes as traditional, as Tibetan medicine. But by and large, in Tibet, people are very interested in maintaining their cultural identity. In Nepal, we found different problems because a lot of people were moving out of the villages, and they were very interested in commercial endeavors and so on, and so they were up against this. They're very strong traders. There's a lot of prestige in trading, and so they would leave the villages. Tourism is bringing in a competing economy, so there's just there are 1,000 problems and so on, but by and large, Bhutan too has a very strong tradition in Bhutanese traditional medicine, and they are trying very hard to maintain it. So it isn't disappearing. There are lots and lots of problems. So
Robbie,
yeah, it's easy to find examples, irrefutable examples of people losing traditional life ways, whether it's language or medicines or other parts of traditional life ways in response to socioeconomic pressures and global changes. But at the same time, in quantitative ethnobotany, a lot of the studies that look at change across time carefully show that it's really hard to quantitatively show a big loss of knowledge about medicinal plants over time. So hopefully there's both a sense of urgency, but also hope there in terms of these cultural continuities.
Well, and hearing the stories and the examples you've given of, using the phone and coming back with photos, all those things, to me, it seems that those show that people are interested, and that in my experience, say in Eastern Nepal, the fact that I was interested helped younger people think, oh, maybe there's something here we should be interested in, because we weren't really that interested before.
That was very important in China, was to show the Chinese that, you know, they'd always kind of get upset and say, well, why aren't you studying Han knowledge? Han knowledge is so much better than anybody else. And I was like, no, you're just not paying attention here. And they'd say, oh, we don't have to have translators. Everybody speaks Mandarin, you know, everybody speaks Mandarin. And they'd never been to a village, you know, Tibetan village, where nobody spoke, or very few people spoke Mandarin. And so they're just to show the Chinese academics and students and so on that this is important knowledge. This is incredibly detailed knowledge, incredibly sophisticated knowledge that there is. I think often that's as much part of our role as anything.
So I'm going to need to wrap up. Robbie, I wondered if you can share a resource for looking at the cultural and the plant diversity and linguistic diversity that you mentioned. Or there was a question about that, but you know, it's a little outside the focus for today, but it's a fascinating area.
Oh, sure. I can just very quickly then say there's been lots of interesting publications about this, but my favorite first stop would be checking out the Living Tongues Institute, which is a nonprofit focusing on exactly this issue that was founded by David Harrison, who I mentioned, and Gregory Anderson, and is doing really great work along those lines.
That's Living Tongues?
Yeah, Living Tongues. I also really, I have a soft spot for a book that David was the author of called When Languages Die, which I was able to help out with, which sort of takes a deep look into each of the sort of types of environmental knowledge that get packaged into language and that can be lost if those languages are moved away from.
Great. And I'll get the names and links for that, and we'll share that in the follow-up email. Thank you both so much for taking the time, and thank you everybody who's joined in on this webinar. And we will I'll share the questions with the speakers in case you feel like responding. There's quite a few, there's about 20. And I just want to share my screen again in closing, but before I do, thank you again for joining and for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.